It's strange how life leads us to moments that alter everything we thought we knew. Sometimes, those moments come as loud, unmistakable events, life-changing news, a major decision, an undeniable sign pointing you toward a new path. But other times, they arrive quietly, slipping into the spaces between ordinary experiences. They disguise themselves as casual decisions, taking a different road home, striking up a conversation with a stranger, or, in my case, agreeing to spend a weekend at a cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains. It was Labor Day weekend, and the world felt restless, caught between the lingering heat of summer and the first cool whispers of autumn. My friends and I had planned this trip as an escape from the constant noise of life. A break from the emails, the deadlines, the everyday responsibilities that seemed to pile up faster than we could manage them. We wanted simplicity, bonfires, hiking trails, nights filled with laughter and stories told in the flickering glow of candlelight. And for the most part, that's exactly what we got. The first night at the cabin was perfect. We sat around the fire pit outside, the scent of burning wood thick in the air, and let ourselves sink into the kind of conversations that only happen when there's nothing to distract you. We talked about the past, about the reckless things we had done as kids, about how strange it felt to grow older and watch life stretch out before us in ways we hadn't expected. I remember looking up at the night sky and feeling so small beneath it, lost in the vastness of a world that carried far more mysteries than I could ever hope to understand. There was something about being out there, away from the artificial glow of the city, that made everything feel more real, more present. It was one of those rare moments where time seemed to slow, where the weight of existence didn't feel quite so heavy. But then came the second night. We had just finished playing cards inside the cabin when Claire, sitting by the window, frowned and said, "Do you guys see that?" At first, none of us did. The forest outside was blanketed in darkness, the kind that swallows everything beyond the reach of the porch light. But then, after a few moments, I saw it too, a faint glow deep within the trees, flickering like a candle caught in the wind. It wasn't fire. It wasn't a flashlight. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, weaving between the trunks as if it had purpose. The air inside the cabin seemed to shift. Ethan, always the adventurous one, leaned forward with interest. Noah, who liked to act fearless but wasn't, immediately suggested it was just the reflection of something. But Lena, the skeptic among us, dismissed it outright. "Probably just another camper," she said, though we all knew there weren't any other cabins for miles. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the light disappeared. It was the kind of thing that should have been easy to brush off. Maybe it was just an illusion, a trick of the eyes, a momentary glitch in our perception. But none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the light itself, it was the silence that followed, the way the night seemed to hold its breath in its absence. I don't know why, but my skin prickled with unease, a quiet whisper of instinct warning me that we had noticed something we weren't meant to see. Looking back, I wonder if that was the moment we should have turned away. Closed the blinds. Ignored it. But curiosity has a way of overriding common sense. Ethan was the first to suggest we check it out. Claire was immediately on board, eager to prove she wasn't afraid. Noah protested, but the fear of being the only one left behind won out over his hesitation. Even Lena, rolling her eyes, eventually stood and grabbed a flashlight. And so, despite the gnawing feeling in my gut telling me this was a mistake, we stepped outside and ventured into the woods. The moment we left the porch, I noticed the difference. The night was unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, no distant hoot of an owl. Just our footsteps against the forest floor, each one echoing louder than it should have. The deeper we went, the more the air itself seemed to change. It was subtle, but it felt thicker somehow, heavier, as if the very space around us was pressing inward. We followed the path where we had seen the light until we stumbled upon something we hadn't expected, a clearing that hadn't been there before. At its center was a circle of smooth stones, arranged too perfectly to be natural. And in the middle, half buried in the earth, was an old wooden box with a rusted lock. Something about it made my stomach tighten. "Maybe we should leave it alone," I said, but Ethan was already reaching for it. The lock was old, barely holding together, and it broke apart easily under his grip. When he lifted the lid, we all leaned in to see what was inside, a book. Small, leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age. One word was carved into the cover: remember. The moment Ethan touched it, everything changed. A gust of wind tore through the clearing, sudden and violent, rattling the branches above us. A low humming sound filled the air, vibrating in my chest like something alive, and then Claire gasped. "The light," she whispered. We turned. It was back, only this time, it wasn't distant. It was standing just beyond the trees, closer than before. A figure, tall and shadowy, glowing faintly from within like a lantern trapped in human form. It had no eyes, no face, just a presence that felt impossibly old, impossibly knowing. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel truly small. Lena grabbed my arm, her breath coming in short gasps. Noah stumbled backward. Ethan slammed the book shut. And then, everything went black. I woke up to birdsong. Sunlight filtering through the leaves. My head pounding, we were back at the cabin. Lying on the porch, as if we had never left, no one spoke at first. We sat in stunned silence, each of us trying to piece together what had happened. When we finally mustered the courage to go back into the woods, we found nothing. No clearing. No stones. No box. No book. It was as if it had never existed. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know why we were brought back to the cabin, or what would have happened if we hadn't been. But I do know this: some things aren't meant to be found. Some mysteries exist for a reason, and sometimes the past doesn't want to be remembered. The air inside the cabin felt different after that night. It wasn't just the fear that had settled in our bones, it was something more than that, something none of us could quite name. A shift, a feeling of being pulled into something larger than ourselves, something we weren't supposed to witness. We had all woken up on the porch, as if nothing had happened, as if we had never left. But the memory lingered. The weight of that moment clung to us in a way we couldn't shake, turning the cabin from a place of laughter and escape into something that felt heavier, charged with an energy we didn't understand. We didn't talk about it at first. Maybe none of us wanted to be the first to say it out loud. To acknowledge that what had happened was real. Instead, we moved through the motions of normalcy. Claire made coffee. Ethan paced near the window. Noah kept checking his phone, even though there was still no service. Lena sat on the couch, staring at nothing. And I, like all of them, felt the silent question hanging in the air between us. Had it been a dream? A shared hallucination, but we knew better. There were no words to explain how 5 people could wake up in a place they had no memory of returning to. No rational way to dismiss the book, the stones, the light in the woods. And most of all, no way to explain the silence that followed us, the way the air felt thick with something unseen. Something waiting. We should have left. It would have been the smart thing to do. Pack up, pretend it never happened, drive back to the city and let time do what it always does, blur the details, soften the edges of memory until it felt more like a story we had once heard than something we had actually lived. But we didn't leave. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear of what it meant if we ran, or maybe it was the simple, undeniable pull of the unknown. We wanted answers. Even if we weren't sure we were ready for them, by midday, Ethan was the first to break the silence. We should go back. Noah's head snapped up. Are you insane? Claire looked up from her coffee. He's right. Lena let out a breath, shaking her head. This is a bad idea. But none of us moved to stop them. Even Noah, who had been the most afraid, didn't protest further. Because deep down, we all felt it. The pull. The unfinished story. The nagging feeling that something had changed us. And if we didn't face it now, we never would, so we went back. The woods felt different in the daylight, but not in the way we had hoped. It wasn't safer. If anything, it felt worse. At night, the darkness had hidden things, let us believe that maybe we were imagining more than what was real. But in the light, there was no mistaking the stillness, the unnatural quiet that made the forest feel like something holding its breath. Like something watching, we retraced our steps, following the path we had taken the night before, but the clearing was gone. There was no sign of the stones, the book, the place where we had seen the figure of light. The earth looked undisturbed, as if no one had stood there in years. As if we had walked into a part of the woods that had never been touched at all. Claire was the one who spoke first. It was here. No one argued. Because it had been. We had all seen it. We had all felt it. And yet, there was nothing. Just trees and sunlight filtering through the leaves, just the distant sound of wind rustling branches that hadn't moved the night before. Ethan knelt down, pressing his hand to the ground, as if touching it might somehow bring it back. He looked up at us, frustration flickering in his eyes. This doesn't make sense. Noah let out a nervous laugh. Maybe that's the point. But there was something else. We all felt it, the moment we had stepped into this part of the woods. It was like stepping through an invisible threshold, a space that wasn't meant to be crossed. The air was colder here. The light seemed dimmer, even though the sun was still high. And beneath it all, there was that same feeling we had the night before, that we weren't alone. Lena shifted uncomfortably. We should go. For once, none of us argued. As we turned back toward the cabin, I felt it before I saw it. The weight in the air. The shift. And then, just as we left the space where the clearing should have been, I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was, not the stones. Not the book, the light, faint, flickering, hovering between the trees, as if it had been watching us all along. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Ethan followed my gaze. His eyes widened. Claire whispered, "No way." But none of us moved toward it this time. Because this time, we understood. The night before, we had thought we were chasing something unknown. Thought we were searching for something lost, something waiting to be found. But now, standing in the daylight with the light watching us from the trees, I realized something else. It hadn't disappeared. It had let us go, and that meant it could have done otherwise. Lena reached for my arm, pulling me away. Don't. So we left. This time, when we got back to the cabin, we didn't talk about it. We packed in silence, loaded our things into the car, and left before the sun had fully set. The drive back to the city felt longer than it should have, as if we had crossed through something we weren't meant to enter and had barely made it back. None of us ever went back to that cabin. We never spoke about that night again, not really. Every now and then, one of us would bring it up in passing, only to quickly change the subject. As if saying too much would bring it back. as if some things were better left unspoken, but I still think about it, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows in my room feel a little too still. I wonder what would have happened if we had followed the light again. If we had stayed just a little longer. If we had made a different choice. I used to believe that the world was something we could understand if we looked hard enough, if we asked the right questions. But after that night, I'm not so sure, because some things aren't meant to be found. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some lights aren't meant to be followed. It wasn't that we were afraid, exactly. It was something deeper than fear. A knowing. A certainty that we had stepped too close to something we weren't meant to see. And that, somehow, it had seen us too. The strangest part was that none of us could fully remember what happened that night. We remembered pieces, the book, the light, the figure standing between the trees, but the details slipped away when we tried to hold on to them. It was like trying to recall a dream that had faded upon waking, a memory just out of reach. All we had was the aftermath, the way it lingered in the corners of our lives like a shadow stretching further than it should. I think that's what unsettled me the most. Not knowing. Not understanding why we had all woken up on that porch as if we had never left. Not remembering how we got back, or what had happened in the moments between. It felt like something had been erased, deliberately wiped from our minds. And yet, the feeling remained. The certainty that something had changed. For years, I tried to make sense of it. I read books on folklore, on lost places, on the strange disappearances of people who wandered too far into the unknown. I found stories that felt eerily similar to ours, accounts of lights in the woods, of figures appearing where they shouldn't, of people waking up in places they didn't remember going to. But none of them had answers. Just more questions. Just more proof that we weren't the first, and we wouldn't be the last. Sometimes, late at night, I let myself wonder, what would have happened if we had stayed? If we had followed the light instead of running from it? Would we have found the answers we were looking for? Or would we have become part of the stories, our names lost among the others who had disappeared into the dark? There's a part of me that thinks we were given a second chance that night. That whatever force existed in those woods had let us go. And that realization, the knowledge that something had the power to keep us, but didn't, was more terrifying than anything else. Because it meant that we had never been in control. That we had only left because something else had allowed it. The years passed, and life moved on. We scattered, as people do. Different cities, different jobs, different lives. But no matter how much time passed, the memory of that night remained. A quiet thing, lingering in the back of my mind, surfacing in the stillness of empty roads and the hush of quiet forests. Then, one evening, I got a message from Ethan. Just a single sentence. Do you ever feel like it's still watching? I stared at the words for a long time before replying, yes, because the truth was, I did. We all did, and maybe, somewhere out there, it still was. There are moments in life that change you, moments so subtle yet so profound that you don't even realize their weight until years later. That weekend in the mountains was one of them. It should have been just another trip, just another memory folded into the long stretch of days and nights that made up our youth. But it wasn't. It was the kind of moment that settled deep into our bones, that shaped us in ways we couldn't fully understand at the time. For a long time, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that what we experienced that night was just a trick of the mind, a shared illusion brought on by exhaustion and the eerie quiet of the woods. I told myself that nothing had followed us home. That the weight pressing against my chest in the dark was just my own overactive imagination. And yet, no matter how many times I reassured myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't fear, exactly, it was a sense of recognition, a quiet understanding that we had brushed up against something far older and far greater than ourselves. The hardest part was the silence between us afterward. We had been inseparable before that trip, bound together by years of friendship, inside jokes, and shared adventures. But after that night, something shifted. We still spoke, still saw each other, still laughed and pretended that everything was the same. But there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. An unspoken acknowledgement that we had seen something we weren't meant to see. And maybe, deep down, we knew that speaking about it too much would make it real in ways we weren't ready to face. At first, I thought the feeling would fade. I thought, given enough time, it would become just another story, something to bring up during late-night conversations, something to laugh about in the safety of daylight. But time didn't erase it. If anything, it made it stronger. The further we moved from that night, the more it settled into us, becoming something we carried whether we wanted to or not. There were small things at first, things that could be brushed off as coincidence. A fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye, moment of déjà vu so strong it left me breathless, the strange way the air felt heavier in certain places, as if I had stepped into a space that didn't quite belong to this world. Then there were the dreams. Dreams of walking through the woods, of something just beyond my reach, of a golden light flickering between the trees. I never saw its face, never got close enough to know what it was. But it was always there, waiting. Watching. I never told the others about the dreams. I wasn't sure if they were having them too, and part of me didn't want to ask. I was afraid of what it would mean if they said yes. Afraid of what it would mean if they said no. Then, years later, I saw it again. It was late, and I was driving home from work, the highway stretching empty before me. There was no reason for me to feel uneasy, no reason for the hairs on the back of my neck to rise the way they did. But I felt it before I saw it, that same familiar weight in the air, that same silent pull I had felt all those years ago. And then, in the distance, I saw the light. It was just a flicker, barely there, hovering at the edge of the trees lining the road. It wasn't a street lamp. It wasn't another car. It was the same golden glow, the same impossible presence that had followed us into the woods that night. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my heart hammering in my chest. For a brief, irrational moment, I thought about pulling over. I thought about stepping out of the car and walking toward it, about finding out, once and for all, what had been waiting for us that night. But then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called Claire. It had been months since we last talked, and at first, she sounded surprised to hear from me. But when I told her what I had seen, she went quiet. I saw it too, she finally admitted. It was then that I knew, whatever had happened that night, whatever we had stumbled into, it had never let us go, maybe it never would. There are moments that define us, moments that linger long after they've passed. We don't always recognize them right away. Sometimes, they settle quietly into the background of our lives, waiting for the right time to surface. That night in the mountains was one of those moments. We didn't talk about it after we left, didn't try to make sense of it. But in the silence that followed, in the way we carried ourselves afterward, in the way we drifted apart without meaning to, I knew it had changed us. For a long time, I convinced myself that it was all in my head. That what happened that night wasn't as strange as it seemed, that the gaps in our memories could be explained by stress or exhaustion. That waking up on the porch, as if no time had passed, was just a fluke, something our minds had exaggerated over time. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend that it had been nothing more than a weird experience, a story to tell and forget. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it in the way I hesitated before stepping into a dark room. In the way my breath caught in my throat whenever I saw a flicker of light in the distance, just for a second, just enough to make me wonder. I told myself that it was just my imagination, that I was letting a single night shape the way I saw the world. But the feeling never left. It stayed with me, quiet but constant, like something unfinished. Like a thread left dangling. And then, years later, I realized I wasn't the only one. It happened on a cold autumn night, in the kind of bar where the music is low, and the lights are dim enough to make it feel like time doesn't exist. I hadn't seen Ethan in months, maybe longer. Life had pulled us in different directions, as it does. But when I spotted him across the room, sitting alone with a drink in front of him, something in me knew I had to go to him. At first, we talked about everything except that night. We caught up on old friends, on jobs, on how fast time seemed to be moving. We laughed at old memories, at stupid things we had done as kids, at how invincible we once thought we were. And for a while, it felt like nothing had changed, but then, in a quiet moment, when there was nothing left to distract us, Ethan leaned forward and said, "Do you ever think about it?" He didn't have to say what it was. I knew. I stared at him, trying to decide if I wanted to lie. If I wanted to tell him that no, I never thought about it, that I had moved on. But I couldn't. Because the truth was, I thought about it all the time. Yeah, I admitted. I do. He exhaled, like he had been holding something in for too long. Then he said, "I don't think it's over." Something in me went cold. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a moment before turning the screen toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a photo, taken from his car window, of an empty stretch of road. But then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, there was a light. Faint, golden, almost blending into the background, but there. Watching. Waiting. "I saw it last week," he said. "And not just then. I've seen it before. Different places. Different times. It's not just a memory." I wanted to tell him he was wrong. That it was a trick of the light, a coincidence, an overactive imagination. But I couldn't, because I had seen it too. Not as clearly as he had, not often, but enough to know that it was real, enough to know that we had never really left it behind. We sat there for a long time, neither of us speaking. There was nothing to say. We both understood, in the way you understand something not with logic but with instinct. Some things don't stay buried. Some doors, once opened, never really close. And some things, no matter how far you run, will always find their way back to you. Looking back, I realized that night in the mountains was more than just an isolated experience. It was a turning point, a moment where the boundaries of what I thought I knew blurred into something far more uncertain. It should have been just another weekend, just another trip with friends, another memory to store away and revisit when nostalgia came knocking. But what happened that night, and in the years that followed, proved that some experiences never truly fade. They don't just become stories. They become a part of you. The strangest part isn't what we saw, or even what we don't remember. It's the feeling that followed us long after, the quiet presence of something we couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. It's the way we drifted apart, not because we wanted to, but because that moment had marked us in ways we were afraid to acknowledge. The way we all carried it differently, Ethan, seeing the light again and again, proof that whatever we had encountered hadn't let go. Claire, who stopped talking about it altogether, as if silence could make it disappear. Noah, who buried himself in routine, as if structure could hold back the unknown. And Lena, the one who never believed in anything, suddenly refusing to be alone after dark. And then there was me. I spent years trying to rationalize it, searching for explanations in books and articles, in folklore and forgotten histories. But there are no answers to some questions. Some things exist beyond what we're meant to understand. And maybe that's the lesson: the world is far bigger, far stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. There are moments in life that remind us of this, moments that shake our certainty and force us to confront the fact that we don't know as much as we think we do. That night changed the way I see the world. Not just because of what happened, but because of what it revealed about how little we truly know. We like to think we have a grasp on reality, that we can explain everything if we just look hard enough. But sometimes, life gives us mysteries without answers, moments that challenge our perception of what's real and what's possible. And maybe, instead of running from those moments, we should embrace them. Not everything needs to be understood to be meaningful. Some things are meant to be experienced, to shift the way we move through life, to remind us that the unknown isn't always something to fear, but something to respect. The lesson I take from that night, and from everything that followed, is this: stay open to the unknown. In life, we often avoid what we don't understand. We shy away from uncertainty, from mystery, from anything that doesn't fit neatly into the structure we've built for ourselves. But sometimes, the most profound moments come from stepping into that uncertainty, from allowing ourselves to see the world as vast and limitless rather than predictable and small. Fear and curiosity often walk hand in hand. The question is, which one do you let lead?